So how does one of the largest news agencies use S3? Well, before I get into that, let me tell a bit about Reuters and what do we do. So Reuters is one of the largest multimedia news agencies in the world, right? And they are the news source for the news networks you actually watch. So we are a wholesaler, which means that we actually sell raw news content in various different formats to customers such as the BBC, the CNN, the New York Times, or the Washington Post. We have a global footprint of more than 2,500 journalists and hundreds of bureaus globally, where we actually gather news for you in various different formats. Our news gets pretty much anywhere. The global reach can go up to billion views on various different platforms such as cable television, online web portals or websites, mobile applications, or potentially even on radio. Reuters is famous for unbiased, accurate, swift, breaking news coverage, and we were always a frontrunner from the technical perspective as well. Fundamentally, Reuters is an engineering organization. But because of the global reach, as you can imagine, we need to receive and we need to send data to location where, internet might not be necessarily accessible. So not just because of historical reasons, but also because of that technical particular reason as well, we need to have large-scale satellite-based distribution and contribution networks as well. So Reuters has a long living past of being an innovator and a technology company. We serve a wide range of content, starting from videos, pictures, text, and we also have a large archive going back to 1896, consisting, or actually started to consist around 700 terabytes of content or tape backups. But as we saw the internet becoming more and more accessible, we realized that we need to start figuring out how to use that. As most people, initially we turn to third parties, and we use their help to obviously use that as a storage backend for us, but also as a content distribution network. Long term, that turned out to be, definitely not beneficial. We realized that even serving our breaking news content, which we consider all the content that we, distribute within the last 30 days, and also our archive content, which is basically everything that's older than 30 days, started to become more and more difficult to serve out. We had very little control over our content distribution network. We had very little visibility. Also, it required extensive support from our perspective as well, and the performance was just not consistent at all. And I mentioned we have a lot of bureaus across the globe. You can imagine those are effectively like mini data centers, basically. We have on-premise infrastructure for that, and they are literally like small islands. But how could we help those islands to actually collaborate better? So what is common in these three solutions or three use cases? Well, their solution, and that would be AWS, the cloud, and S3. So before we actually completely migrated over to S3, we actually spent a good few time, and spent a good few, weeks and months to even build POCs before we get the confidence to even start off with it. And one of the POCs and one of the solutions we built, I actually did a presentation about that last year as well. It was called Reuters Lives. So if you're interested in learning more about live streaming and how Reuters does that, feel free to check it out. So once we realized the benefits and also, how you can cut costs using the cloud and more specifically S3, we realized that the best decision would be to actually fully invest into putting all of our content onto S3. But not just the scale that was super useful for Reuters, but also some of the capabilities such as the multi-part upload API. I mean, as you can imagine, because we serve and we acquire and gather very large video files, we also need to upload them efficiently, right? And using the multi-part upload API, we could actually cut down the time on how much it takes to actually upload a large file, potentially going up to like gigabytes even. So it definitely enabled to have faster uploads, faster contribution, and it also helped us to make it easier to distribute our content to our clients. Not to mention to have full access to the AWS ecosystem at that point. So let me show you a quick diagram about one of the, I guess, it's a pretty standard workflow for news agencies in terms of how we actually acquire content or how third parties or our partners contribute content to us as well. In most cases, they either contribute potentially via FTP or they use our web form, log in with their MFA device, upload their videos, all of that capability is actually containerized. Or potentially they would have an RSS website which we actually crawl or constantly monitor whether they have some new content that we could potentially serve out through our platform. So once we acquire their video content and text that, helping that particular video to be served out, we obviously want to standardize on how we store that metadata as well. So most news actually arrive within like XML format. So obviously we want to turn it into something that's easier to store, such as JSON. And once we have that transformation done by Lambda and we have the video, we just put that onto S3. And after that, it's all basically data-driven, right? And most of it is also serverless, where we can do that. So once we have the content on S3, that kicks off a Lambda function that triggers like a workflow for step function, and we start to do the video processing against the content to make it ready and available to be served out across the globe. But how do we serve it out across the globe? Well, so we didn't just migrate our storage backend, we also migrated our content distribution network, and we moved completely over to using CloudFront. So for us, S3 and CloudFront really goes hand in hand, but it was just so ridiculous how much easier it was to set up, for example, CloudFront compared to like, going to some of these third parties and set up a CDN through them. I literally took a couple of minutes to set up a content distribution network and make your content accessible globally. But it wasn't just the fact that it was super easy to set up. It was also so much more scalable. It was so much more performant as well. The throughput just significantly got better once we moved over to use S3 and CloudFront. So for us, it really goes hand in hand. I guess one thing to point out with CloudFront as well, it's super cheap, but if you do have a consistent workload and you know exactly how much content your customer is going to consume, pay attention to potentially opt into like a reserved capacity option. That can save a lot of money for you. But back to S3. So we have seen a good overview on the storage classes as well. And as I mentioned, we have breaking news and we have archive news. And some of these patterns actually perfectly aligns with the storage classes that AWS offers. So for example, the infrequent storage class and the Glacier storage class saved a ton of money for us because it aligns perfectly with our breaking news coverage. So the second use case I mentioned is that we have a massive archive. As you can imagine, all of that was stored on tapes. It's a content going back to 1896. At that point, it was around 700 terabytes of content. Now it's probably more than a petabyte. But imagine that all being on tapes. So once we had that confidence to build a cloud solution, because we'd done that before, we realized one of the main objectives for that solution should be to try to build it all serverless. The second one, as I mentioned, is standardizing or trying to standardize on that metadata. Because if you have a content going back to 1896, you're probably going to run into a good few different standards throughout that time. So as part of our migration and as part of this project, we also had to come up with various different workflows to create this solution within the cloud. One of that was to actually digitize all that content from tapes. At that point where we actually done this project, we didn't have so Snowball wasn't even available. So we actually have direct connections going back to the AWS data centers. We were all uploading all the content up into S3, spun up a lot of spot instances, and did a batch processing against all of them, running for like months. As you can imagine, breaking news is not going to remain breaking news for too long, right? So the volume of news coverage is actually diminishing with time. So we had to also create a workflow to get the new content that should be now part of the archive to be processed and ingested into the archive capability. So that was another workflow we had to create. The third one, the last one, is to try to create a solution which can actually provide an on-demand video processing capability for clients who wants to get our content. But because we don't really want to have all the permutation of our video stored in S3, we wanted to create that in an elastic and on-demand approach. So what I mean by this is, imagine in Europe, for example, they consume videos in 25 frames per second. In US, it's all 2997. Obviously, there are people who like MP4. Some people consume AVC I50, AVC I100. There are a huge permutation of video files and options in terms of how you could store your content. But we don't want to store all of our archive in all of those versions. We want to have the capability that when the client comes to us, we can actually create that particular version for them in real time, if it's possible. So that's what I'm going to quickly demo. I actually got a video of what I'm doing here, but this is the Reuters Connect marketplace, where basically you can access the Reuters content. So what I'm actually going to do here is just going to go into our video feeds, order them to basically show you the oldest content that we have, and by that actually to show the video archive that we have, and try to download one of those files in 25 frames, for example. And then I will go through what actually happened in the background. So I chose the Wright brothers' first airplane flight. So that is all stored on S3, and as you could see, on demand, I just clicked and it downloaded the file for me. All looks pretty simple, right? I mean, it's news content. So this is what happened in the background. You are the customer on the bottom, and what was actually going on is, when I went through that search and I found my content, when I clicked that button to download that file, what happened was I actually made some API calls to the Amazon API gateway that we got set up, which was actually just triggering off a simple Lambda function that started the whole workflow to actually start doing the processing against that particular file, scale up the instances, and actually start to trigger the business logic that we might require in this particular case. Because we have a large data set within Amazon as well, or within S3, we wanted to create an index for that to make it easily searchable. So all the metadata is actually stored within Elasticsearch, and within Elasticsearch, we have the location to all the videos within S3. And when that particular workflow was kicked off, that was actually triggering, to scale up some EC2 instances, potentially additional containers, depending on whether you needed GPUs or not, do the processing against the file, put it back onto S3, and serve it out through CloudFront. And then the client just got the file, basically, and it downloaded onto their workstation or potentially into their capability if they were using it all via APIs. Now, as you can imagine, there might be videos which could be longer than this, maybe like, I don't know, half an hour or 1 hour or a year render or just, like an aggregated video about what was going on in this year. In those cases, you don't really want your client to sit around and wait for that particular process to happen, even if it's real time, because, that's just boring. So that's where we ended up using Amazon Simple Notification Service to actually send an email notification to the client once the actual processing has been finished, so they don't need to wait around. So I mentioned we have a pretty large footprint in terms of bureaus as well. Now imagine a normal day-to-day workflow where you have a camera crew, they go out on the field, they try to capture some videos, and maybe they don't even have internet access, or maybe they do, but it's like really not stable. And then you have another set of people, a journalist, who is going to edit that content that should be brought back either physically, maybe as an SD card, or maybe they could actually publish it back to the bureau that's closest to them. Now, some people need to edit that locally. You need to have like a file storage there, or like a NetApp, or something like a file share. And then after that, you really need to push it back into the headquarters, process it again to change it into various different frame rates, various different formats, and then you make it ready for distribution. Now, the cloud can help to eliminate so many of the steps in this particular process, and that's what we're actually working on now as well, is not only to try to publish all of our content directly into the cloud, but to try to do all the processing closest to that particular event, closest to that particular location as well. Because that will actually enable better collaboration on stories. Like imagine what we could do as well. You have, let's say, 4K or 8K content. You could put all the raw content up onto the cloud, maybe reprocess them to create a proxy of those files, maybe a smaller resolution or a smaller version of that particular file, and let the journalist edit that rather than the raw file. Because, streaming down 8K content onto someone's workstation, that's still not really going to happen, right? I guess it depends on the location. But in most cases, you really want to have some low resolution version of the content so people can edit against that, and then maybe still make the change on the raw file itself. Now, this move to the cloud will not just help with the collaboration, but also help with minimizing the technological footprint. Because what we could end up going to or moving to is to potentially just have a laptop for every single journalist, and that's about it. And also, it will enable machine-augmented metadata at source, because there are so many machine learning services that you can now plug in. So what are the list of features that we actually love from S3? Well, I mean, I already pointed out that the storage classes are like just perfect for us. Like we literally are the best example of some of these storage class options. So we do make use of obviously standard for all the breaking news content. If it's getting older, then we move them or transition them into infrequent access. And if it's even something that we don't really want to use, or we know that it's not going to be used in this year, we move to Glacier or even to Deep Archive or Deep Glacier. And obviously, you also want to have like a copy of your raw content. So Deep Glacier is perfect for that too. And it really makes it easy to use those simple lifecycle rules. I mean, actually, to move this petabyte scale of content to a different storage class, you could just set up a simple transition to do that within literally 2 minutes. Simple bucket policies, again, absolute favorite. Because imagine, like, there might be clients who are also in the cloud, right? And if you actually want to give some of your content to them, or actually give them the capability to potentially use it, what you could do is set up some simple bucket policies to just let that particular account to read that content. But also at the same time, you don't really want to have all your content replicated 4 times, for example, if you have multiple lower environments. You don't really want to have it for dev and QA and PP and production. But you do want to use the actual production data in all environments. So what you could do is actually have a read-only access from your lower environments to your production data set, for example, in our case, to the archive data set, and save the cost. Obviously, request to pay is a multi-part API, really good for us in terms of like the video uploads and in cases where we need to like acquire content from distant locations. Cross-regional application and VPC endpoints to make work with those content securely. The bucket metrics as well, like, without the bucket metrics, it would be quite tricky to understand what is going on, but with that, we know exactly how much data and how it's growing and how much it's going to cost as well. So why are we so keen about S3? Well, one of the few reasons is that it really enables an event-driven or a data-driven architecture, and you could see as well that most of our capability was serverless, so we could even move even further to move them into Fargate or EKS Fargate or some of those capabilities. And also it really enables us to create larger data lakes and to potentially serve our content out to other people for potentially machine-augmented capabilities or for their own training exercise. That's exactly why the recent announcement around data exchange now has Reuters data being accessible through that marketplace as well. So I mentioned the machine-augmented workflows. So just because we are already in S3, we do enable our capabilities with so much more. Like imagine running through that archive capability or through recognition maybe and just identify faces that we didn't know about or the journalists were not caring about that because that particular person wasn't famous when the video was captured. Or maybe go through comprehend and try to extract some entities from that textual data that we have. Or maybe have automated transcriptions or even potentially multiple different languages for all that massive archive data set, right? And maybe create something custom using SageMaker. And I mentioned that we have a large satellite-based distribution network as well. I mean, sure, I could see a future where S3 will enable us to potentially replace that as well and maybe let AWS handle it for us. And with that, I do hand it over to Mo to talk about S3 access points.
All right.
Thank you.